morning, everyone, and welcome to our discussion for today's meeting for market parameter changes enhancement. My name is Brenda Corona, representing the ISO Stakeholder Affairs Group, and today I will helping facilitate today's meeting and discussion of the draft final proposal and tariff language. I'm also joined by Guillermo Bautista Aderarte, our Director for Market Analysis and Forecasting, and I'm also joined by David Zetlow, who is our attorney who helps with the tariff language today. So today we will be going over a few housekeeping reminders as this call is being recorded for informational purposes only, and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. Our meeting is structured to simulate dialogue and engage different perspectives, so everyone's welcome to provide any comments through the chat and also through verbal comments as well. If you can, please refrain from repeating any information that has been spoke about by other colleagues, but we will make sure our time is effectively used for the next 3 hours. Instructions to asking a question during the call, you may use the raise hand icon above your chat window, and this will allow us to pick on your name and make sure when your line is unmuted, please state your full name and affiliation before stating the comment. If you do experience any technical issues, feel free to reach out to my event producer, Michelle, or myself, and we will be able to help you. But for any general questions, feel free to submit them through chat, and also make sure to type in the company name so we can know who's speaking and where you're coming from. And for now, I just want to give you all a overview of the stakeholder process of where we're at. And at this time, we are providing the draft final proposal during the proposal development phase. Next step is to collect comments, and those comments are due next week. As well, the final proposal is hopefully be done after that. So with that timeline we're providing here, it's shown at this location. And now I'll go ahead and introduce Guillermo Bautista Aderarte for the next few slides in this presentation, and we'll check on his audio as well to make sure it's working.
Thank you, Brenda. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to go through this draft final proposal. And let me start. I think we have discussed this a couple of times in previous cycles. First of all, an apology for taking this long to bring this to conclusion. We started discussing these issues back in 2020 when we assessed the performance of the policy 1B that was related to the pro rata funding of CRRs back in 2020. And we identified one of the main drivers for that outcome, and we initiated that discussion with the stakeholders. Then we have these events of the summer conditions that put a pause on many of the other things that we have to assign certain priority, and this specific item was paused. We tried to resume this back in April, and then we ran into another complication because among the many comments that we received from participants, there was in particular one comment that I will elaborate further that requires some additional effort. So we tried to make that to work, given other competing priorities that we have in terms of software changes. That was not possible. So we are coming today here with a compromise to try to bridge the best of the two conditions that we want to address. And hopefully we now can move forward. Right now, the expectation is that we can bring this to the session of the Board of Governors that is going to take place on March. And then we can just go straight forward with the tariff language, and hopefully within 60 days of the filing, that will be somewhere in the time frame of June, we can make the changes into our systems. With that, let me start with the feedback that we got from participants. And we expanded the paper to address the suggestions and the feedback, and we responded to those comments. They are in the first section of the proposal. And let me bring the main items here for discussion and give you more transparency in what our take was about these comments and feedback. One of the comment that we received across different participants was, why not go further rather than just apply this reduced shift factor threshold only to the aggregated locations, the labs and trading hubs. The labs meaning default load aggregating points and trading hubs. Why not apply that to all locations? We heard that feedback. Other feedback was, well, why don't you apply that also to intertie locations? I would decompose that response in two pieces. The first one is that we see merit to further assess if we can apply this reduced shift factor threshold also to a specific interties. You may recall the logic behind for the choice of using the labs and trading hubs is based on the fact that they are quite large. They are very sizable in comparison to any other location in the system. We may be talking about the specific generation locations, for instance, where we may have a specific physical resource in the range of 150 megawatts, 200, 700 megawatts at most. And when we talk about aggregated locations such as the labs, it's a quite different magnitude change, because the labs may be in the range of 15,000 megawatts, 20,000 megawatts. Therefore, the size alone poses a good criteria to try to target those specific locations that, even if they have a small shift factor, given the size, the magnitude of those injections, they are going to mean a very significant contribution to the power flow of specific constraints. That was really the logic behind why they go after specifically trading hubs and the labs. Now, there are certain interties that could be sizable as well. We have 3-4 locations, scheduling points that are behind a specific transfer capability of certain interties, such as Malin, Palo Verde, El Dorado potentially, NOP to some point. They are in the range of 3,000 megawatts. So 3,000 megawatts correspondingly to a small shift factor could still be, relatively speaking, a meaningful contribution that we have to consider if it makes a difference in the settlements of the CRRs. Now, one of the attempts that we tried this a few months after we received the feedback was to assess if there are merits. We can find cases and see the solutions, how that works for applying this to interties. The complication that we have boils down to a limitation in our software. In order for us to apply specifically a different shift factor threshold only to interties, we would have to make a software change, and that's really the bottom line. And with that, we would have the ability to do a more counterfactual analysis and come with the elements, whether it's adequate or not to apply this reduced shift factor to interties as well. We tried to get that, and that is the reason we delayed this until now, because we really wanted to see if we could do that assessment and that analysis to come all together with one single proposal. But we realized that we were taking too long on that, and we still don't have the software change, given many other competing priorities that we have to make software changes. So the compromise that we're bringing today is that we have the functionality already developed since a while ago to apply this reduced shift factor threshold specific to trading hubs and the labs. However, we still see the merits to further assess if we can apply that to a specific interties based on the size of the intertie, the ones that are meaningful enough. And that requires, first, a software change, and second, more analysis to see if there are merits to that. We are not there yet for that specific component. And we still want to consider that as an option down the road. And that is the reason we are trying to structure this proposal in a certain way that we are going to discuss later today. So what I'm saying is that we are not completely saying no to the option to potentially apply this to a specific intertie based on the size of the intertie, but that is going to be subject to first having the software capability to do so, and second, to analyze if there are merits to that. We don't have that underground work done at this stage. So there is a potential to apply this to interties later on. Now, going into the second overarching question, why we don't apply this to all locations? We have still relevant concerns that are still applicable as of now, and these are the concerns that we explained since the beginning. And that is, in a numerical conceptual basis, yes, we shouldn't apply any threshold to any shift factor. We should just go with that. In practical terms, that is not feasible for two reasons. The first one is that applying very small shift factors threshold to locations specific to generators may not be a good utility practice, because the end result operationally could be that we are going to have these large generation movements to relieve congestion for very little. And the example that we have portrayed here, that was one of the cases that we saw when we were ready to launch the MRTU back in 2009, was that you may have a far away, electrically speaking, generator in the northern part of the system that is moving largely to make this very tiny movement in the congestion management for a constraint that is way far in the south. That is not just a operationally good practice to have, because you have to make these huge movements of generation for very little gain in congestion management. That is still relevant as of today, and therefore is still a concern that we have to keep in mind. And the second one is numerical. One of the concerns comes in computational effort, because the more shift factors, the more records you account for below the 2%, you end up with a huge set of small shift factors for different locations, for different constraints. All that permutation becomes, at some point, potentially a concern when we have to meet certain timeframes to run the market. So it's a prevalent concern that we still have. So nothing has changed in that sense from the original concerns as of now, and therefore we don't see to be this a feasible option to consider down the road unless something dramatically changed in terms of these two good utility practice concern and the computational concerns of handling that many records for very little effectiveness. And the basis why we are making the exception for trading hubs and the labs, again, has to do with the size, with the magnitude. We are talking about movement of generation for 200 megawatts farther north in the system for a constraint in the south. That is quite different to talk about a 20,000 megawatt resource like a DLAB movement to influence congestion in certain areas. So that is really the distinction where we are drawing the line. And that is precisely why we are targeting specifically the labs and trading hubs, because they are sizable enough that even small contributions are going to represent potentially meaningful change in the power flows. So a long answer, but I want to give you all the relevant context as to why we are making this delineation of what we can do now and later versus what is not an option moving forward. The second comment is along the same line. We have this threshold in the energy market, day ahead, real-time market, and also we have a market for the congestion revenue rights. Market in general sense, because we have allocation and auction, but the CRR process as a whole, in which we also clear CRRs, the whole product. There is a financial CRR instrument, and there is no threshold in that market for the shift factor threshold. So one question was, well, why instead of trying to be targeted in applying a smaller shift factor threshold to certain locations in the energy market, why don't you just put the same threshold of 2% into the CRR process? And then you have this synchronization between the two markets. At glance, seems to be obvious why we couldn't do that, but this is more nuanced, and there are more complexities that are important to consider here. The first one is that we also have definitions of the labs and trading hubs in the CRR process. The clearing process, however, is different. When we go into the CRR process, either an allocation or an auction process, the DLABs and trading hubs are decomposed into the individual locations, and they are clear at the individual location level. So imposing a 2% threshold on the aggregation concept doesn't do any different to the clearing process, because the clearing is done at the individual component level. That is different to the energy market, where we basically have the DLAP as one entity effectuating the redispatches at the energy market level. That is one very basic differentiation. The second one that is more nuanced has to do with the fact that when we're talking about congestion revenue rights, they naturally come in pairwise definitions, source to sink. And when the clearing process runs through this, the effectiveness of the CRR, measured by the shift factor of 2%, 5%, whatever level it is not at the individual source or sink level. It's at the composed differential of source to sink. In the technical literature, this is called power transfer distribution factor, and it measures the relative effectiveness between two locations. You inject 10 megawatts here, and you withdraw 10 megawatts on the other side. And the net movement of these relative variations is what gives you the effectiveness on that specific constraint. I could tell you, when we go into the energy market, the congestion management process that is done basically as we run the market takes similar approach, but that is dynamic. We don't have pairwise generation points between each side of the constraint. What inherently happens in the congestion management is that the congestion is going to realize that it needs to ink one resource on one side of the constraint and deck another resource on the other side of the constraint. But they are not natural coupling resources. This is done dynamically as part of the optimization. Therefore, trying to impose a threshold of 2% to the CRRs would have to be naturally set at the level where the CRRs are clear, which is at the pairwise source to sink. Now you have a discrepancy between what we have between the energy and the CRR market. And this would be the main reasons why it's not that obvious to go and apply a threshold straightforward to the CRR process. Let me pause and see if we have any comments, feedback on this specific discussion of the comments.
Hi, Guillermo. So we did have someone who raised their hand, but they've lowered their hand at this time. For those on the call, to please raise your hand, just click on that raise hand icon above your chat window, and then if you're on the audio line, press #2. So I do see Callie Wells. Michelle, if you may unmute her line.
Callie Wells, your line is unmuted.
Thank you. Good morning, Guillermo. It's Callie Wells with WPTF. Quick question, and I don't know if you're going to get into this later on when you get to the, I guess, more of the proposal. Feel free to defer. But I thought in your paper somewhere you mentioned in regards to possibly applying a lower or removing the threshold to the intertie locations, you were going to craft the proposal to provide that flexibility. And I was curious kind of how that's going to be incorporated into the tariff, because the tariff language didn't seem to provide that. So I have that question. If you want to defer that to later, that's completely fine.
Yeah, and thank you, Kelly. And that's a good point. I would prefer that we defer that until we reach the discussion of the tariff language proposal, because yes, you are right that we have a small gap there that we need to discuss with you all and see where we land. But the original expectation is that yes, there are two ways, and maybe I'm starting to go into that idea, but let me give you a preview of that. There are two ways we can proceed, and we really need participants' feedback to see where we could be more successful. The first one is do what we know we can do right now, the DLAPs and trading hubs, and go with the proposal, apply that to only DLAPs and trading hubs. If later on we realize that yes, interties could also be subject to this reduced shift factor threshold, then we can basically go all over again through the process of discussing with participants, do a filing at FERC, and get that incorporated. So that will be like the full normal process of doing one piece at a time. The alternative that we glance through the proposal is, well, if we find that there could be merits and that is going to be subject to what we find through the analysis, maybe to save us one full round trip of the stakeholder discussion, filing, and so on, maybe from now up front, we can put the language in such a way that we want to get this for the labs and trading hubs, but leave the door open and flexible enough at FERC that allow us to apply this to the interties. And we will have to be flexible enough, and that is where Dave can go into the details of how we can achieve that. Potentially, there may be a small risk there because we are asking for more flexibility than what we could have right now, and that is something to consider and measure if it is worth to take that approach. So we would really like to hear the sentiment from the market, how they feel about taking either of these two options, but we are open to try to create that flexibility in this first filing so that we can save a few months of a whole stakeholder process to make an incremental change. So I can give you that information and we can have more discussion when we reach the tariff discussion.
Okay, I appreciate that preview and I'll wait till that discussion later on. Thanks.
You're welcome. Okay, any other comment, feedback? Okay, let's continue then. Can we move to the next slide? There is another set of comments regarding the application of the reduced shift factor threshold. One set of common comments was regarding the concerns about the twofold concern. One is the impact on prices. That is a very fair point. Obviously, this is going to impact prices. And the second one about the actual congestion management specific to the constraint. There was a concern that indicated that by the fact of reducing the shift factor threshold to the labs and trading hubs, we may end up with more constraining feasibilities in the system. Actually, it's the opposite, because by the time we consider now further the labs and the trading hubs as effective injections in the contribution of power flows, effectively we are bringing more controls, more variables to control the power flow on the constraint, and effectively it's more flexibility for the market to find an optimal solution. So reducing the shift factor threshold for the labs and trading hubs is actually going to lead us in the opposite direction, where we're going to have more chances to resolve the constraints without going into the infeasibility, because now we have that additional flexibility, that additional control in the congestion management process. And that effectively, I think, goes to the bottom of the theme here, which is having that additional accounting of the flow contributions from the labs and trading hubs when they can mean to be significantly meaningful contributions specific to a small constraint is going to be no more than providing more accurate formation and pricing of the power flows. And that is a movement in the right direction to make things more accurate and more precise. Again, the trade-off here is that we're trying to balance this with making sure that we can still get a solution and we don't create these concerns of unreasonable movements when we do that across the board to all locations, even for those that are very small in terms of magnitude. Consequently, when we go into the price formation, yes, there will be an impact because now there is a contribution of the D-Lab and the trading hub that before was not considered and now is going to be considered. And if it's going to be considered as part of the congestion management, naturally there will be a consequence of that impacting the price formation of those locations. Because now you're going to have the shadow price of the constraint, whatever constraint we are managing, times the shift factor that measures the additional contribution of that movement into the price of the D-Labs and trading hubs. It's going to make a more accurate pricing of that location by identifying that additional contribution of the power flow. How extreme the prices could be? Well, you can take any value anywhere between the up to the bid cap or to the penalty price that will be 1,500 in 1,000 megawatts, sorry, in the congestion management process. And that effectively means $1,000 or $2,000 in some cases when we increase the bid cap. Means that you have the shadow price potentially going all the way up to $1,000, and now the additional contribution to the marginal congestion component is going to be measured by the additional shift factor that we're considering. If before we drop any contribution below the 2%, and now we have, let's say, a shift factor of 1%, effectively the additional contribution to the price by means of additional marginal congestion component is going to be up to $1,000 times the new shift factor consideration that could be 1%, 1.5%, 0.5%. That gives you a reference of how dramatic changes you could see in the marginal congestion prices. There was another comment regarding the concern that this would increase prices in the energy market. No, it's not going to only increase prices. Congestion is relative to the location of the constraint and the location we're dealing with. In this case, the D-labs and the trading hubs. They can be on either side, the upside or the downside of the constraint. And therefore, the impact of this change, depending on the relative location to the constraint, could be a plus or a minus. And that means that the impact of this change to the prices could go either way. It could actually increase the D-lab marginal congestion component, or it could reduce the marginal congestion component of the D-labs and trading hubs, because it depends on the relative location to the constraint. It could be on either side of the constraint. So it's not guaranteed that the price is going to always increase. Again, it's relative to the congestion and the constraint. So there could be changes that can mean an increase, but also a decrease of the prices. And again, this goes back to the genesis of what is the principle. The principle is to make this more accurate, including the price signal that this is going to generate. And we have added a section with the additional analysis that we have done for some specific cases. We have to identify the cases where this constraint was relevant and then rerun the case to see how the price would change. We have provided that in detail in the draft final proposal, and you can see prices just increase, but also prices decrease depending on the constraint, depending on the location, depending on the day, and even the hour of the day. So it's not for granted that it's going to be a movement in one single direction all the time in all locations. And let me pause to see if there is any question or follow-up on this specific item.
I do not see any questions at this time.
Okay, let's move on then. Next slide, please. There was a set of comments regarding the scope of this initiative, and I hope I did a good job explaining the rationale in the previous rounds. I have to reinforce the framework that we have. We have a whole structure, a whole process in place to decide what initiatives we take on, to take into account all the feedback from participants. This is what we have portrayed as the roadmap of the policy initiatives. And it's a short-term, medium-term, long-term picture and view of how we are going to approach things. There are many things to do. We have to take a priority at the end of the day of what to do next. And we always receive feedback from participants. We encourage participants to submit any request for consideration in this roadmap. And based on all these components is where we try to do this balancing act of what initiatives could take priority to do at certain time. That goes for items that require an intentional policy discussion, because we have to change the principles, the main fundamentals of what we are doing. Historically, you may have seen that from time to time, we have to address effectively what I call production issues. These are issues that arise as we assess the performance of the market, and we do some assessment whether that requires a fundamental change on the principles that require us to go back to the policy and make the tariff changes and so on, versus the narrow subset of conditions where we believe is a very small tuning to the efficacy of what we are doing. And for this small subset of conditions, we typically take these expedited initiatives to make that very targeted change. In this case, this is a good example of this subset of corner cases. We identified the shift factor threshold to be a very narrow targeted condition impacting the efficiency of the CRR settlements. It's not touching the fundamentals, the principles of how we do congestion management. It's not changing the fundamentals and the principles of how we settle CRRs. It's this tuning to the practical elements of the implementation. And because of that, we feel confident that we can take this in a quick track to make this expeditious change, very narrow, very isolated to this efficiency point. And because of that, we feel confident that we can take this approach in an expeditious fashion. However, when we start going into the depths of what else is going in the overall CRR settlements, yes, there are other dynamics, other concerns that we hear and we see that could have elements to potentially expand or make a more holistic stakeholder discussion. But it's important to differentiate in what space we are operating. This specific initiative is very narrow, very targeted only to gain the efficiency by making this tweak. Again, we are not going after the principles, after the fundamentals of how we are settling CRRs. Because of that, we don't feel comfortable or with the basis to really expand, open up this stakeholder initiative to go to the core principles and fundamentals of how we settle CRRs. That was a very long and exhausting initiative that we went through in 2018, 2019, and we defined the principles, the fundamentals, and if there is something that has to be addressed along that core portion, we will be open to consider that, but it has to be a more intentional, defined policy effort rather than trying to do this in a last-minute expedited fashion. Because of that, we are not in a position to open up, expand the scope of this very narrow initiative for anything else that goes beyond these specific tweaks of the functionality of the shift factors. With that, what we commit is that we are going to continue to be more active assessing all the potential drivers that may be impacting eventually the CRR settlement. And that will be the first starting point to understand what else is out there, to see if it is still an issue of the efficiency of the implementation or whether it really touches more on the fundamentals, the principles of the policy, so that we can then have the guidance based on the data and the analysis of what to do next. And because of that, we are not going to open up any other items for this specific initiative. Is very narrow in the scope, and we're going to keep it within that context. And in the upcoming months, we will be providing more analytics, more information, explanations of what we see to be drivers for the outcomes that we are seeing. I acknowledge that what we are seeing is an unintended outcome. There may be a gap in the implementation and the policy, or it could be precisely what the policy intended. This is a way broader discussion that we have to have, and for that we need to have a good starting point, and that is understand what's going on. The specific item of the shift factor threshold is one of the items that we specifically identify. It's not by any means the only one, and therefore we really need to boil down into what else is impacting the CRR settlements, and that is going to be for the next stage of the analysis, and then see where we go from there. Let me see if we have any comments before we move to the next topic.
We do have one question in queue. Callie, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Hey, Guillermo, it's Callie Wells again with WPTF. I appreciate your guys' explanation on keeping this specific effort narrowly scoped, But I just want to make sure I understand that distinction that you are making when it comes to whatever results might come out of this additional analysis you guys are committing to, which again, we really appreciate you guys continuing to analyze the impact on the CR settlement. So if, for example, out of this analysis, you guys might identify another driver that maybe didn't align with kind of the original intent, kind of something along the lines of the shift factor threshold cutoff, kind of the original principles or intent of the 2019 changes, would you guys consider doing another effort similar to this that's again narrowly scoped, or anything that comes out of that analysis that you guys might want to consider making changes, you would have to have a more broader stakeholder discussion that goes back to kind of the principles that were established back in 2019?
Yeah, I would be a bit reluctant to preview what approach we're going to take without knowing what the drivers are. I think clearly the identification of what's going on, what are the drivers, is going to largely define the next steps. If we happen to find out that, oh yeah, these are drivers that are more on the way we implement things, and I think just to put an example, I think one of the other items that we identified in the past is that this may also be driven by the contribution of loop flows. Well, loop flows was not specific within the principles and the scope of the CRR policy initiative that we implemented in 2019, right? Is there any way we can improve the modeling or something like that? Potentially, if I have to assume things, I would say, well, potentially this still falls into the area of gaining efficiencies by improving how we are implementing different things. It doesn't touch per se the principles that we define in the policy, right? But if now we go into finding that, well, it's actually how we settle, how we define the logic of the settlements, of how we account for deficiencies versus surplus and so on, that starts to sound more like, well, now we're going into the core principles of the policy, right? That would require a more extensive discussion if there is something to be done within the provisions that we have, or whether we have to open up a whole initiative to be able to change those principles. So it is kind of subjective based on what really the drivers are going to be, and they could put us in either of these two tracks.
Okay, I appreciate that, and we think it makes complete sense to start with analysis. We're always supportive of making market changes based on the data, so we look forward to seeing that result. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly, for the question. Michelle, do you have any other comments on the phone?
There are currently no additional questions in queue.
Okay, let's move to the next one. Okay, now changing topics. The previous slides were focused specifically on the shift factor threshold. That is one of the two components. The second component is regarding the proposal to have an expedited change process. And this is effectively to give us some flexibility to make sure that we can enable certain changes to specific penalty price values to address potentially unintended market outcomes that we see when we analyze the production of the market. And there were few comments and questions on that. There was a common theme, and that is that if CAISO can commit to something more specific in terms of deadline, right? In terms of the time frame to communicate and inform the market of what's going on. I think that's a very fair point. I think when things happen in production, they happen very quickly, and we have to try to address and have mechanisms to address those expeditiously. It's a good thing. Now, I can fully understand that even though we are busy trying to fix this issue, it's important also to give the transparency to the market of what's going on. So we have adjusted the language in the proposal to say that no later than within 3 business days of the change, we are going to communicate this to the market. Just to ensure that we have some room and we don't get into a compliance by default just because we have no time to do anything else. I believe a business, 3 business days is a good trade-off to ensure that we have some flexibility to do our steps, our work, and then be communicating on a timely basis to the market of what's going on. And that is a specific change to or a detail that we have added to the proposal. there was another comment in the more general sense of, can you give us more insights of what the scenarios you are trying to hedge against, and what are the typical cases where you have to deal with such that you require this process? I would say it's going to be very subjective to try to make up illustration of specific cases. However, what I can tell you is the general dynamic what we typically see that could give rise to the need of this process. And in general, what we are doing is that anytime we implement a change in the market, either through an operational improvement, either coming from a FERC order or an initiative that we undertook, in many of those cases, we are required to come with new penalty prices, with recalibration of the existing penalty prices. And just to put an example, for instance, when we implemented the scheduling priorities for forward transactions, interties and WILs, that went to the core of the penalty price, right? We have to recalibrate, change penalty prices to align with the expected scheduling priorities. I can tell you that we have over 50 different penalty prices in the market. Not all of them are acting all the time. Some of them trigger based on the conditions that we have, but having that many penalty prices really requires a whole effort to calibrate and synchronize all these penalty prices. We do a lot of analysis offline before we put this into the market. We go after the typical cases. We go after stress cases to ensure that when we're in these corner scenarios, the calibration of these penalty prices still work as intended. But granted, it's impossible to cover every single permutation of potential scenarios in the market. So from time to time, we see that there are cases that start to pop up because there is a new logic. There are certain bidding that change, certain configuration that has changed, and now each scenario becomes evident, and that scenario may not give you the intended outcome based on the calibrated penalty prices that we had at the beginning. The proposal that we are trying to put here is precisely to give us the flexibility that when this type of scenarios arises and now we have evidence of a new interplay, we do have the ability to be able to accommodate and recalibrate the penalty prices to handle that more efficiently and avoid this unintended consequence. That would be the overall dynamic under which this type of cases may trigger the need for using this expedited process. And in the paper, the body of the paper, you can find out that I pointed to one specific case that we had like last year, that we actually went through a whole initiative because it's required to change the relative priority. But it just highlights how you can plan for certain things. And in this case, for instance, in this initiative of last year, we planned like, well, in case the marginal loss component, the component of the price, is going to be typically within a range of $100. Well, there may be cases where you have these corner solutions that the marginality of the losses is greater than $100, and now the priorities that you are trying to effectuate no longer remain in the sequence that you expect. This is the type of cases that we cannot guarantee. We always try to create enough room between penalty prices, because we cannot just go to infinite, right? The higher the number you have in the market, the more you influence the optimality of the solution. There is a trade-off here in numerical terms to get a reasonable value of penalty prices. And they need to be far apart enough so that in normal conditions, you don't skip one over the other and you lose the priorities. But when there are cases, we have to recalibrate and push one value to one side to create more room for the condition that we experience. That is in general the dynamic that we observe, and because of that, we do not expect to have that process to trigger that frequently. That doesn't happen every other day. It's a very infrequent scenario, but we know it's bounded to happen with all the changes that we do to the market, and therefore we need to have that flexibility to be able to mitigate for the unintended consequences in the market solutions. Next slide, please. Okay, let me pause to see if we have any questions regarding this second topic before we go into the actual proposal. Michelle?
I do not see any questions in queue at this time.
Okay, perfect. Let me go then into the matters of the proposal. You are going to see that the proposal, the draft final proposal, is not that different to the proposal that we have in the past. The structure remains largely the same. We have two components that make up this proposal. The first one is the reduction of the shift factor threshold, and the second one is the flexibility to have in place an expedited process to make a parameter change. Penalty price value changes. Let me go one by one. Next slide, please. And by the way, these are not dependent, so they are really isolated, but they are in the space of penalty prices. That is the reason we put it together. Going back, I think through the explanation I provided in the response to comments, many of these can be obviated. I just want to go quickly through the main elements of the issue and the proposal. This goes back to the first item, that is the shift factor threshold. We use a 2% threshold across all locations, across the market, and that is to ensure that on one end, we can account for the effectiveness of moving resources to do congestion management, while on the other end, we still remain with practical solutions that don't create issues for operations in terms of unexpected or unreasonable movements of generation to do congestion management, while at the same time, we remain within a feasible solution that can be achieved with the computing capabilities that we have. The shift factors are primarily used for the congestion management. They are the ones that drive the congestion on the system, define what movement has to happen, and therefore is going to impact how resources are dispatched, but also how prices are formed, because we have specifically a congestion component in the market to signal the movement of resources to handle the limited transmission capacity that we have in the system. And we have been with this threshold since we went live. We have some concerns when we went live of using a shift factor below this threshold because of the computational burden and the ineffective redispatch that we have. That is still relevant, as I indicated, but the proposal we are targeting is specific to trading hubs and DLAPs. Next slide, please. Why we are going after the DLAPs and the trading hubs? Because of the size, how sizable they are relative to other resources. As I indicated, you may have a resource, 200 megawatts, 300 megawatts of PMAX. When you talk about the 1% effectiveness, 1% contribution of that injection relative to a constraint, the contribution is relatively small. When we're talking about 1%, 2%, something below the 2% for a DLAP that may be in the summer time frame easily 20,000 megawatts, well, even if it is below the 2%, that is still quite meaningful contribution to the flows. And this became evident when we analyzed the CRR settlements. And you can see that there is a very natural trend here. It becomes more of an issue when we are dealing with relatively small size constraints, and that happens to be typically with lower voltage levels. And depending on the geographical distribution of these low voltage level constraints, you can see that that can be more concentrated in certain parts of the system where we have lower voltage constraints. The point here is that when we're talking about, for instance, the contribution of a DLAP, let's say 15,000 megawatts, and let's say the shift factor is 1.6, as of now, it wouldn't be adding any contribution to the flow because it's below the threshold. However, when you do the math, 1.6% of 15,000 megawatts would be 240 megawatts. If we have constraints that are impacted because they have, let's say, a transmission capability of 150 megawatts, missing or not accounting for the 240 megawatts of flow contribution from the DLAPs can actually completely reverse the direction of the congestion. It's a transmission line of 150 megawatts and we are missing the contribution of 240 megawatts that is even bigger than the capacity of the constraint. These are the cases that become more obvious because of the combination of the contribution of the DLAP that is not considered right now, versus or relative to the size of the constraints where the congestion is occurring. And that is a typical case, typically in the northern part of the system, where we have more dominant configuration of low voltage constraints. Next slide, please. And how we came with this complication was not per se within the energy market. This came along the analysis that we performed for the efficiency of the congestion revenue rights settlements implemented back in 2019. And that problem really transpires when we go into the settlements of the CRRs, because now the shift factor becomes relevant. When we have the contributions of the CRRs when they were cleared with no shift factor threshold, and now we bring the shift factors of the energy market that are bounded by the threshold, naturally you create this inconsistency in the accounting of the flows. And that reflected effectively in the settlements of the CRRs. Back in the detailed analysis that we did all the way in 2020, we actually sized the implication of this problem, and for a couple of constraints that was in the range of $3 million. So it's significant enough to make a difference on how the CRRs are settled. And it could have a two-way implication. One, because you may end up overpaying for CRRs or under-collecting the congestion rents. And this is a two-sided effect that we may see by the inconsistency of how we account for the flow contributions. And conceptually, it could happen for any location that is below the 2%. In practical terms, this really becomes relevant for those that are very sizable in magnitude, specifically the DLAPs and the trading hubs. Next slide, please. What is the proposal? The proposal is that we can target specifically the DLAPs, the trading hubs, that are within the CAISO balancing area. And in the straw proposal, you could see that originally we didn't have a very good reference to specifically what value we want to use. Ideally, we would like to go and basically apply no shift factor threshold. There are some practical implications here, right? And I think trying to go with something small enough that it still takes out any numerical noise out of the picture and still give us the benefit of considering these small contributions is going to be a good trade-off for the proposal. So the proposal now is specific of using a new threshold or a reduced threshold for shift factors, specifically to the labs and trading hubs for a value of 0.2%. I know the same number may be confusing because it's 0.2% versus the existing 2%. It's a tenfold reduction of the shift factor that we currently have in place. That, we believe, is going to give us a trade-off between accounting large enough for these contributions of the labs and trading hubs, while we still keep some safety net of not accounting for every noise in the numerical space of a much smaller shift factor thresholds. The other specific detail that we have added here is that the issue arises really in the settlements of the CRR, and that is inherently between the CRR settlements and the day-ahead market, which is the market in the energy space that is a reference to settle CRRs. For consistency, once we do something in the day-ahead market, we want to align that with the real-time market to avoid any discrepancies and inconsistency. So it makes sense that by making the change in the day-ahead market, we apply that the same way in the real-time market. Originally, we were exploring if that could also apply to other aggregating points in the Western energy imbalance market, specifically the ELAPs, that are the analogy aggregating points for demand in the wind. Because this issue really focus on the CRR and implications with the energy market and for consistency in the real-time market, we don't find that is a strong argument to extend that to the Western energy imbalance market. There is no settlements in the real time for these DLAPs that may touch the day-ahead implications. There is no day-ahead for the WIM, and there are no CRRs to settle for the WIM. So in this case, we really want to keep it very narrow in the scope to be what the issue is really materializing, and that is in the CAISO balancing area, specific DLABs and trading hubs. And with that, the rest of the locations will continue to be subject to a 2% threshold, as is currently done. And that would be specifically the proposal that we have. And I will still hold a little bit the discussion of the flexibility if down the road we can apply that to the intertype, because we see the merits, but we still have to do the assessment, and we want to see how we can portray that in the tariff provision we want to file. Let me pause to see if we have any comments or questions for the first component of the proposal.
Hi, Guillermo. So I don't see any questions in queue at this time, and we can go ahead and proceed. Oh, one question just came up, Guillermo. Let's go ahead and take their hand. Mohammed?
Hi, Guillermo. This is Mohammed Karawi at the NYA. So just a quick question. The first thing is the 0.2% is still rather like it is a great improvement over the 2%, but if we are talking about like the DLAB for PG&E in the summer, we're looking at easily 20 gigawatts, and that's about 40 megawatts. So that's for low voltage constraints, like 60 kV and below, that's above the limits of the line, or some of the line, or even 80%, and then about 40%. What is the, I guess, is it just a numerical challenge to lower this to take this further into a lower threshold, or is there any other consideration? And just as a point of comparison, ERCOT's threshold is much lower than that, and it's for all locations. Thanks.
Here is really striking a balance between the aim of being as accurate as possible while having a safety net to ensure that we don't introduce any numerical unintended consequences. I think experience is going to tell us how larger of an issue this remains. And I see your point, right, that any value still for a sizable amount is going to be still some what's in the power flow contribution. So unless you completely erase that, there will always be a contribution to the flow. So right now, this is a balance in the practical space to ensure that we don't introduce any numerical challenges that may be unintended. And what we don't want to end up is that day one when we implement this and now we have these numerical complications, we have to do something to correct this, right? So I think it's a gradual safety approach to take it as low as we believe can be numerically approachable.
Thanks, Guillermo.
Thank you, Mo. Okay, let's see. We have another comment. I see Seth Han.
Yeah, thank you, Guillermo. I just wanted to clarify what you'd said. So is the shift factor threshold itself there for computational reasons? So the optimization solves, the mixed integer program will solve faster, and without that cutoff, you'll run into issues with running your iterations. Is that the reason it's there?
That is one component. That yes, the smaller the shift factor, the more record you account and the more processing you have to do. Right? That could be one consideration. The other consideration is really once you start approaching the value of 0, things start to happen in the numerical space. And I would say for a typical day where you have enough supply, low demand, and not that very stressed cases, I wouldn't see any difference of using even a smaller shift factor threshold, right? But we have to hedge and be mindful that in many cases we're going to be dealing with very stressed conditions where you cannot foresee all the numerical interplays that are going to be working in a specific condition. And unfortunately, these are like wild cases that unless they happen, we may not know how they are going to portray, right? So having that mindful said that, yes, things are bounded to happen because when you start going into the neighborhood of 0, numerical conditions start to arise. So we want to be mindful that we don't create a potential issue here that when we are under these corner cases, we start to see some interaction that was not envisioned by reducing this level.
Okay. And when you ran your simulations, did you run into that? Is that what you're saying? Like when you ran your counterfactuals and stress test the optimization, is that what you found?
We ran some normal cases and some other cases that were more stressed. I can tell you from the cases that we found, we didn't find cases with G factors below the 0.2%. All they were 0.2% or higher G factors.
Okay. And then one more question. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. One more question. Are you aware in your paper that you in the tariff language itself you put down 0.1%?
Yeah, and we cleaned it up that before the presentation. Thank you for calling that out. And so we catch it when we were doing the last cleanup. And there is more cleanup that we may have to do to the tariff. So we're going to go into that.
Okay. Thank you, Guillermo.
You're welcome. Okay, I don't see any other hand. Let's move on to the next slide, please, Michelle. The second topic is regarding the procedure, and I already provide some background, some context as to why the need and what the scenario we're trying to protect against and have the agility to be able to make the changes. And this has some history because we tried to have this process approved by FERC. It was not the right filing that we proposed. FERC came back and said, well, you can refile and make explicit changes to this if you want. So we are trying again as a dedicated effort rather than in response to another filing that we did in the past. And we have provided some more general explanation on what type of conditions and dynamics in the market we may have to rely on these expedited changes that we want to have through our process. And the basic need is that we know we are bounded to have these unintended outcomes from time to time because we have had those in the past. So it's bounded to happen. It's not very frequent, but if they ever happen, we need to ensure that we have a more resilient process to be able to manage those expeditiously. And that is the whole reason why we want to have this in place. And as I understand through the analysis that we have done in the filing, other ISOs have similar mechanisms to be able to implement those expedited changes. Next slide, please. There was one set of comments, not in this straw proposal, but when we tried to put this process in the previous filing. And that was that giving us this flexibility potentially could result in the case of changing the relative scheduling priorities. We have very explicit language to be very specific, indicating that no, the intent of this or the scope of this wouldn't be to change the relative scheduling priorities. We would be bounded to make adjustment to the penalty prices as long as we are not changing the relative scheduling priority among the different items that we have. That means the space that we would have to maneuver for these changes would be limited to changing the penalty price values as long as we don't change the original and intended sequencing of the priorities. And we have a specific language to be clear about that intent to not be beyond the scheduling priorities relative to the existing practice that we have. Next slide, please. I think this is no more than some background. One of the changes that we have done specifically is the accommodation of committing to a specific time frame to communicate this change to the market, and that is within 3 business days. Next slide, please. Okay. This is really the proposal that we have for the twofold initiatives in the G factor threshold and the expedited process change. Now, given the narrow scope of this initiative, we wanted to consolidate this draft final proposal with some discussion of the tariff language. And we have in the call today David Slowlow. He's our counsel for supporting this initiative. He can go into more details. The idea here is to be very straight into what language we are expecting to have in the filing. And there is one specific section that refers to the shift factor threshold. Here you have the original section strike through with the current language that is generic to all locations. The one in red is expecting to be accounting for the proposed change of 0.2% for the labs and trading hubs. And now coming back to the original question from Kelly earlier today, if you read this language, it's very specific, very black and white that it's only for the labs and trading hubs, and there is no reference or flexibility at all to account potentially for intertie locations. And there may be a need to revise this language to provide that flexibility. We realize that we could do that and potentially, based on your feedback, have a final proposal in the next round that is effectively the final proposal. So let me pause and give the stage to Dave to see how he wants to further elaborate on this approach. David?
Yeah, hi. Good morning, Guillermo. Good morning, everyone else. So I think what you have on the screen here is the language we included in the last posted version, or the posted version of the draft final proposal. And I think there was a question earlier, excuse me, I believe maybe from Callie Wells, about how does this address the interties, and really this draft, I just missed the detail, in the paper that talks about we are still reserving, they want to reserve the ability to implement the lowered threshold for interties as well. And so we have a revised version of the proposed language. I don't know, Brenda, are you able to project that without too much difficulty? I don't know if you're switching. Yeah, okay, great, there it is. Perfect. So this is really more accurate in terms of capturing what the intent of this part of the proposal is. So you see the revised sentence that talks about the 0.2%. The only difference substantively between what you saw before and what you see here is there's a reference to interties with significant total transfer capability as specified in the business practice manual. And so the reference to trading hubs default lapse is what you would have expected to see from before. We set the threshold at 2% for all their nodes. Fine, that should be, basically substantively the same as what you saw before. The big thing is the interties, where the policy paper did reference that we want to implement that for the larger interties as we see it feasible. To capture that in the tariff, we say it's interties with significant total transfer capability as specified in the business practice manual. The idea being that in the BPM, we will be able to specify, what we mean by the significant total transfer capability. This is meant to be the significant interties on our system. The BPM will specify, how we're going to exactly draw the cutoff between which are the significant interties and which are the ones that are not large enough to justify the lowered threshold, and therefore they would stay at the 2% value. So that is the revised tariff for the shift factor threshold. So if we have any questions on that, please feel free to queue up.
Thank you, David. So let's hold a little bit to see if anyone has any questions. So for those who are on the call, please use the raise hand icon above your chat window. And if you're dialed in audio, please press #2 so we can call on you. But I don't see any questions, but I did see some people raise their hands, but they dropped them off. So I see Callie Wells, so we could go ahead and take her question.
Callie, go
Hi,
ahead.
it's Callie Wells again with WPTF. I'm not sure if this is a question for you, David or Guillermo, but I'm looking at kind of the schedule on this policy, and it looks like you're not planning on doing another, like a final proposal. So when will the stakeholder community know which tariff language you're planning on filing?
I can take that, David, and you can help me with the timing of the filing. Kerry, as we are trying to follow the standard process, and what you have seen through this presentation and the supporting proposal posted last week is what we call the draft final proposal. We're incorporating here the discussion of the tariff language, and after we also set the deadline for receiving participants' comments, I believe by January 31st. Once we receive that feedback, we're going to have a window of time to make any last-minute changes or accommodations based on the feedback, including this revised version of the language, if everybody is okay with that. And we're going to post what we call officially the final proposal. I believe that is going to be posted on the 7th or the 8th of February. And with that, we will be really in the path of bringing this to the board.
Okay, I appreciate that. I didn't see that step as a final proposal in your next step little table. So I appreciate you clarifying that. Thanks.
Yeah, and I have to emphasize, I would really appreciate that participants can provide feedback to us specific to the language and what David's proposing, specific to trying to have the flexibility of potentially including interties, because that is some type of what if scenario, right? Or whether we should go just straight with what we know as of now, that is the labs and trading hubs. So it would be really useful to see where participants stand on this type of flexibility we want to create.
Okay, we'll definitely give that some thought and include our feedback and comments.
All right, I do see we have one more person in queue, Seth.
Seth, the
So I unmuted.
Thank you. Excuse me. I saw in the paper that you had noted that you didn't have, the CAISO didn't have the market functionality to run simulations testing a shift factor reduction at individual locations such as interties. I just wonder if you could expound a little bit on that. Is that like a major hurdle, or is that something that could be acquired in short order? Do you have a feel for that?
Yes. If we look at in isolation, the complexity of that software change is not that large, right? It's a relatively small effort. It's not really just about the size of the effort on its own, but also the competing priorities, right? If you see, for instance, the last few months, we have always something in the pipeline. So it's a matter of making the space and the right time to bring something completely out of the pipeline of what we have scheduled for implementation. And for instance, in the recent months, that pipeline was completely busy with what we are going to be implementing next week. That is the flexible ramping product, right? So it's a matter of finding the right spot to have a pause and be able to interject and have that change. So on its own, it's not that large effort. It's a matter of what would be the ideal time to be able to implement that. And right now, we don't have the flexibility to selectively apply a shift factor to individual locations, including interties. The change of code that we did like effectively 3 years ago when we were going after the labs and trading hubs was very narrow to apply to the labs and trading hubs. Yeah, maybe in hindsight we could have think that, well, can we be flexible enough to have it for every location, and maybe many of those are not going to be subject to any change, but at that point we were very narrow to apply that change to the labs and trading hubs.
Okay, so if I heard you right, you envision that after certain projects run their course, such as Nodal FRP, that would free up the ability for you to be able to run to ground an analysis on intertie reductions?
Right. Just to be more straight on my answer, yes, I don't expect this to be taking us 2 years to reach a conclusion whether interties are good or not. So it should be in short order when we get a pause in the immediate project.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Thanks for the explanation. Thanks.
Okay.
All right, there are no additional questions in queue.
Sorry, David.
Okay, no, that's fine. Yeah, there's no more questions, then that's great. And so I think, like Guillermo was saying, well, the revised version of the draft tariff we just had on the screen a moment ago, that's what would be incorporated into the final proposal document. Yeah, that right there. That's just in case there's no confusion. There'll be a final proposal document. This is what you would see there. And again, just for process-wise, again, if you all didn't quite follow, you know, sometimes usually we'll have a separate tariff stakeholder process that sort of runs in parallel or lags behind the timing of the policy process. Here, because it's such small targeted tariff amendments, just seem more efficient and more reasonable just to wrap the tariff discussion in with the policy discussion. So that's, if this part of it seems a little unusual, it is, but it's just because it's such a targeted tariff change, it just seemed more efficient to just deal with all of it in the same set of calls rather than setting up a whole separate set of calls to just talk about one sentence. So that's, in case you were confused, that's what was going on here.
Guillermo, we can't hear you. You're on mute.
Yeah, sorry, double mute. Yeah, let me take advantage of Dave being here so I can cover the next item, that is the second proposal. And specifically, we have introduced this language in the STRO proposal. The only change that we have done here, as you can, and sorry, I forgot to put this in red. The only change with respect to the STRO proposal language is that we are being more specific in the item number 2, that we are going to indicate that we are going to notify market participants within 3 business days after the change. And that is just to give more certainty of how soon you expect to see any notification or transparency of the changes that we are implementing. The rest remains basically the same, and this will be a brand new section to the tariff. I think we have a hand from Brian. Brian?
All right, Brian, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Yes, hi, Guillermo. Hi, David. This is Brian Baker. I do have a question about this. The language says that the ISO will make a Section 205 filing if they make a temporary modification, that they will notice market participants 3 business days after the modification. If a market participant believes they have been disadvantaged by the change or that the change amounts to undue discrimination, does the market participant have any remedy until the ISO makes a 205 filing at FERC? Would they submit a BPM change request? What is the process by which a market participant could, has recourse with regard to the change?
David, do you want to take on that one? I think more on the process of the filing.
Right. Okay. So the concern would be, again, this is a temporary change corresponding with a filing. Is your concern like, what if we make the change, you find it's objectionable for whatever reason? How do you stop us from proceeding if this tariff language were in effect? Or how would you, if it's temporary but up to 90 days, if we're going to leave it in place for 90 days and you don't want it to stay in place, what do you do? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, the question is, does a market participant have any recourse with regard to such a change only after the ISO has made the Section 205 filing, if the ISO intends to make that permanent? Or does a market participant take any action? The ISO provides notice 3 business days. Does a market participant have any ability to, object to that once the 3 business day notification has been made, or do they have to wait for the 205 filing?
I guess obviously there's always informal opportunities to raise concerns. I guess that is, subject to whatever, procedures, you would choose to take at FERC, which I can't, you always take whatever steps you think are appropriate in terms of making your own filings. But the way the tariff provision is written is that, these are for, extraordinary cases, and we're trying to just get something implemented quickly to keep the process moving smoothly, and that, it's somewhat of a trade-off in terms of that versus, providing the more full, opportunity for debate and discussion about what's exactly the right parameter value. So I think this approach represents something of a trade-off, and that's what's here in front of you. If there's something about a parameter change that's so, objectionable to an entity, I mean, they can pursue whatever emergency relief at FERC may be allowed under the rules. I don't know if there's much more I could really say about that than just, you have to kind of piece that together yourself if it's really that worrisome about what specific change we're doing if this tariff language were in effect.
Oh, okay, thanks, David. One last question, just to try to put a little substance to this. If a market participant was going to make an informal reaction to the notification of the parameter change, does that look more like a city ticket? Does that look like an email to their client rep? Any guidance on that?
Yeah, I think, Brian, the standard channels that we have for any participant to raise any concern remain in place, right? I think in addition to these standard channels, we're going to be very explicit about discussing this specific topic. So we're going to communicate within 3 business days, and we are saying through the explanation that we are basically to initiate the process, right? So it's not that we do the change, we communicate, and nothing else happens. We are going to start the whole process to move forward the filing within 30 days, I believe, because then you need 60 days for approval. So there will be a lot of communication. It's not just to tell you that we made a change and nothing else happens after that. So you have the standard channels of communications in addition to the explicit and intentional communication effort and discussion we're going to have for that change. Now, I don't want to come across like diminishing a potential concern. I take at face value your concern, and it's a fair point. I simply want to give you some context because I'm afraid there may be some expectation that we are doing some far-reaching changes here. And that somehow has to do with the previous round of discussion we had when we tried to file this the first time. Just to be completely clear on the scope of what we are trying to achieve here, we are bounded to not be able to change the relative scheduling priorities. If we have an export that is low priority followed by an export that is high priority, and we have a will-through transactions, and they have a intended and expected sequencing of how we're going to reduce those when there are tight conditions, that sequencing, that relative scheduling priority will not change by the expected changes that we want to implement. That sequencing, that priority will remain in place. All what we're trying to do here is that many times we can address the issue by adjusting the relative penalty prices without changing the priorities. Let me put an example. Let's say that we have the power balance constraint and the will through priorities of high priority wills of $14.50. And then we have the high priority exports to be $12.50, and then you have the low priority exports to be $1,050. We keep them far apart enough that under normal conditions they are going to work, right? If we come along the case where, well, now we have a case, and I'm making this up on the air. If now we have a case where for one unintended consequence, interplay that we see in the market because of losses or some other numerical condition, we ended up reducing a high priority export and awarding a low priority export. I can guarantee you, if you have that transaction, you are going to come tell us why you have that unintended relative priorities all flipped around, right? You shouldn't be doing that. And yes, we shouldn't, right? But numerically, this is happening because there is this unintended logic that is working. What we would try to do is to play within this range of values that, what, maybe instead of having 1250 versus 1050, we're going to have 1300 versus 1050, and with that, we resolve the issue that somehow, because of losses or something else, now we are not respecting the priorities. So I would say actually the opposite way, the concern to be, that we're trying to address the issue that is unintended and that you may most likely not be happy with by making this flexibility and this change, not the other way around. And again, in any case, we would be bounded that we cannot make the numbers in such a way that now we break the priority that is already defined in the tariff. I just want to give you that broader context, and hopefully that gives you some peace of mind of the direction and the nature of the change that we potentially may have to use for this process.
Yeah, Guillermo, thank you very much for all of that. I completely understand the ISO's rationale and desire for this authority, but on the other hand, changes to scheduling run parameters will, as you noted earlier in the call, affect the prices that are determined by the CAISO's market. For the ISO to have the ability to change those parameters outside of making a 205 filing, has some ramifications, and I just want to fully understand what market participants, what recourse they have in the event that the ISO makes one of these things. Hopefully you won't have to, and hopefully it will have minor impact, but I just want to understand how the process will work. Thanks much for the discussion.
Thank you, Brian. Anything else, Dave, before we move to the next topic?
I do not see any additional questions in queue.
Okay. Next slide, please. The last piece has to do with the decisional classification, and we're expecting, because we are touching specific tariff provisions, we have to go through this initiative and then eventually bring this to the Board of Governors. Because of that, we have to have this decisional classification, which components are under the advisory or joint authority of the WIM governing body. And we went through this classification specific to the two components that make up in this initiative. The first one is the reduction of the shift factor threshold to 0.2%. As I indicated, this is going to be very narrow to apply only to aggregated locations within the CAISO balancing area, specifically the labs and trading hubs in the day ahead and the real time. There is no application of this to any location in the WIM areas or market. Because of that, we believe that the role of the governing body for this specific proposal would be advisory. Now, for the second component, that is the process change. Well, this is kind of open-ended because it's a process change that could allow us to address any issue that may happen either in the CAISO or any other balancing authority area, including the WIM areas. And because of that potential that some changes may be coming from the issue that we foresee in the WIM areas, we believe that this is an item that has to go through the joint authority. This is the rationale, this is the expectation that we have for the decisional classification. Again, it will be very useful that you provide us any feedback on what you think about this decisional classification so that we can take that into account for our final proposal. And I see one hand raised there. Kelly?
Hi, Guillermo. It's Callie Wells. One last question. So I understand why you guys are doing the advisory role for that first point, because you're only changing the shift factor at DLAPs and trading hubs in the CAISO BAA. But under an EDAM paradigm, is this something that you would discuss, whether or not applying similar treatment in the EDAM process?
Yes. When the EDAM comes, we would have to make some specific arrangements to make sure how that works, right? Because this is under the current construct. That is only the real-time WIM construct. Once we have something else, we have to make a realignment and update how that would look like.
Okay, so under EDAM, there will be potentially be discussion on whether or not to apply the 0.2% at EDAM or ELAPS and Trading Hub in that form. Okay, yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. And that brings us to the end of the presentation. You can move to the next slide. This is just the schedule. And I take Kelly's point that we missed to put the posting of the final proposal. That is going to happen effectively in 1 week after the stakeholder comments are due. So that should be posted by February 7th or February 8th. And again, I would really like to emphasize the need for you to provide us any feedback along the items that we discussed this morning, specifically the flexibility we want to create for the application of the shift factor threshold to the labs, the decision classification, the language that you have seen for the tariff. And Brian, if you want also to put written comments for your question regarding what records participants may have, I think that would be useful so we can really capture that and memorialize that in the proposal. That's really all what I have, Brenda, Michelle. Thank you for helping us.
Thank you, Guillermo, and thank you, David, for your assistance during this call. It was really helpful. We did get a lot of questions. And so for those, just a reminder, we do have that comment template available since last week, and you're able to access it on the webpage of the initiative website. I'm trying to send that out right here at this moment on this page, but this link will be on the presentation. But if anyone has any other questions, feel free to add those on the comment template. If not, we will be closing this call at this time.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.